It begins with a scream no one heard, carried on the autumn wind of a quiet Canadian town, swallowed by fields and forests, leaving behind nothing but the kind of silence that becomes a lifetime of questions. On the afternoon of October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop was supposed to walk through the door of her family's home in Queensville, Ontario, drop her school bag in its usual place, and rush to greet her mother with her bright, eager smile. Instead, she vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving a community grasping for sense in a story that only grew darker the deeper anyone tried to look. Christine was the kind of child people remembered without even trying to. With her soft brown hair, her shy but warm laugh, and her habit of carrying little treasures in her pockets, marbles, baseball cards, tiny folded notes, she moved through the world with a quiet curiosity. Her mother, Janet, often said that Christine collected moments the way other kids collected stickers. Her father, Bob, described her as gentle, careful, and endlessly patient. She loved animals, especially her dog Freckles, and she loved her older brother Ken, whose leukemia treatments had kept the family in and out of hospitals for months leading up to that fall. Through all of it, Christine never complained. She waited, she helped, she smiled. She was the light in a family fighting to stay afloat. October 3rd was meant to be an ordinary day, a return to normal after so many weeks of hospital routines. Christine finished school as usual and planned to go home, feed Freckles, and then meet a friend at the local park. But when her mother returned to the house at 4:10 p.m., the door stood closed, Freckles waited unfed, and Christine's belongings lay untouched exactly where she had left them that morning. At first it was confusion, not fear. Then it was worry, sharp and insistent, and by nightfall, it was terror. Police arrived quickly, and neighbors joined the search by flashlight, calling Christine's name into fields painted black by the sky. But every shout returned empty, every trail led nowhere. The hours crawled into days, and with each one the invisible border between hope and dread grew thinner. When Christine's disappearance hit the news, it spread like a shockwave. Queensville, a town where most doors were left unlocked and children walked freely, suddenly felt unfamiliar, its safety shaken, its trust fractured. People locked windows they had left open for decades. Strangers eyed one another with suspicion. And in the quiet space between those reactions, the investigation began to twist toward its first terrible mistake. Police focused early on a neighbor, a 24-year-old man named Guy Paul Morin. He lived next door to the Jessops, separated only by a fence. Morin was quiet, introverted, a man whose passions were music, cats, and building model airplanes. He had no history of violence, no record, and no reason to hurt a child, but he was different. And sometimes difference becomes its own kind of target. Some neighbors described him as odd or strange. One claimed he seemed aloof. Another said he kept to himself too much. None of these were crimes, but they became threads investigators tugged on as the pressure to solve the case mounted. When Christine's body was discovered months later, on December 31, 1984, in a secluded rural area about 50 kilometers from her home, everything changed. A farmer, out clearing brush, found her remains alongside evidence that she had been raped and murdered. The news hit Queensville like a blow. The Jessop's grief deepened into something so heavy it seemed impossible to survive. The town's fear hardened into demand for answers, for justice, for someone to blame. Police returned to Morin. They searched his home, collected fibers, and questioned him repeatedly. He denied any involvement. "I didn't do this," he said softly during one interview, his voice barely rising. I didn't even know her well, but his calmness was interpreted as coldness, his eccentricities as warning signs. When forensic analysts found fibers they believed matched items in Christine's clothing, the case turned aggressively against him. The trial that followed was as tense as any courtroom drama, except the stakes were devastatingly real. Prosecutors painted Morin as a loner with unpredictable tendencies. Defense attorneys countered with evidence of police tunnel vision, contaminated forensic samples, and unreliable witness statements. But facts had become tangled with emotion. The community wanted closure, and closure came in the form of a guilty verdict in 1992. Morin was sentenced to life in prison. For a moment, just a moment, the system believed it had succeeded. The Jessops, shattered but determined to honor their daughter, tried to accept the outcome. The police closed the file, and an innocent man sat behind bars carrying the weight of a crime he had not committed. But truth has a way of resurfacing, even when buried by pressure, fear, and the desire for resolution. Within months, questions began to stir. New forensic experts challenged the fiber evidence, calling it unscientific and flawed. Defense advocates pushed for more testing. In 1993, the Court of Appeal overturned Morin's conviction and ordered a new trial, but something far more important happened next. DNA testing advanced. In 1995, DNA results conclusively ruled out Morin as the perpetrator. Every biological trace recovered from the scene excluded him. The prosecution's case crumbled to dust. Guy Paul Morin, after years of being branded a child murderer, was formally acquitted and declared innocent. The Ontario government issued a public apology, but no apology could return the years he lost, the grief he endured, or the permanent scars the ordeal carved into his life. And yet, even as one nightmare ended, another returned. Christine's real killer was still out there. For decades, investigators revisited the case in intervals, wrestling with incomplete evidence, aging witnesses, and a crime scene long turned cold. The Jessop family, still mourning Christine, and still haunted by the wrongful conviction, hoped for answers but braced for the possibility that none might ever come. Then, in 2020, 36 years after Christine's murder, the landscape of criminal investigation shifted once again. Genetic genealogy, a technique using public DNA databases to trace family trees, had begun to crack open cases once believed unsolvable. The Toronto Police Service decided to apply the method to Christine's case, sending her DNA evidence for genealogical analysis. It was a final attempt in a long, painful search for truth. The breakthrough was startling in its clarity. A strong match led investigators to a man named Calvin Hoover. Hoover had lived near the Jessops in the 1980s, worked with the family at times, and had moved within their social circles. He was described as friendly, soft-spoken, and thoroughly unremarkable in a way that made him invisible. But darkness can hide behind the quietest doors. When police compared Hoover's DNA to the samples collected from Christine in 1984, the match was definitive. The genetic profile was exact. There was no uncertainty, no room for interpretation. Calvin Hoover was the man who raped and murdered 9-year-old Christine Jessop. But the revelation came with one last bitter twist. Hoover had taken his own life in 2015. He would never stand trial. He would never answer the questions that had haunted a family and a country for decades. He would never face the justice Christine deserved. When police informed the Jessops, Christine's mother whispered, "We finally know," but the words carried both relief and devastation. For her father, Bob, the discovery was a vindication of something he had long believed, that the real killer had gone unnoticed while another man's life was destroyed. For Morin, the news was both a confirmation of his innocence and a painful reminder of the system that failed him. Investigators reconstructed Hoover's life as best they could. He was married, employed, and known to drink heavily. Some who knew him described abrupt mood swings. Others said he carried a quiet sadness, but no one, not a single person, suspected him of the brutality inflicted on Christine. The contrast was chilling. The people who had once considered him part of the background of their lives now stared into the abyss of the hidden monster he had been, and the knowledge that he had lived 3 more decades as a free man only deepened a tragedy. In the aftermath of the announcement, the Jessop family stood before cameras, faces lined with years of grief and endurance, and thanked detectives for never giving up. They spoke of Christine's kindness, her love of animals, her tenderness toward her brother, the way she giggled when Freckles tried to chase butterflies. They wanted people to remember the child, not the crime. But beneath their words, the unspoken truth hung heavy. Nothing could undo the past, not the horror of Christine's last moments, not the years of not knowing, and not the wrongful conviction that stole a decade from a man who simply lived next door. Justice had finally spoken, but justice came too late for everyone. The story of Christine Jessop is more than a crime. It's a story about a community that lost its innocence, a family torn apart twice, once by the crime itself, and again by the failure of a system meant to protect them. It's a story of a man condemned by circumstance and prejudice, and of a killer who hid in plain sight until science finally pulled back the veil. It's a reminder of how fragile truth can be, how easily fear can cloud judgment, and how deeply the past can echo through generations. As the case closed at last, one image lingered in the public mind: a 9-year-old girl with soft brown hair, pockets full of small treasures, and a smile that should have grown into adulthood. Her life was brief, but her story reshaped an entire country's understanding of justice, forensic science, and the need for humility in the face of uncertainty. In the end, there are stories that fade, and stories that remain. Christine's remains because it demands that we remember not just what happened, but how easily it could have been prevented, how deeply the wounds of injustice can run, and how important it is to keep searching for truth even when decades have passed. And though the years have moved on, though the fields where she disappeared have grown and changed, though the people connected to her case have aged or passed away, one truth endures like a whisper carried on the wind. Some answers take a lifetime, but they arrive all the same, and when they do, they change everything. Christine Jessop's story leaves only one unforgettable sentence echoing in the quiet. Justice delayed is never justice denied, but it always comes at a cost no one should ever have to pay. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.